Yuta Okkotsu has always been a cursed character. From his introduction in Volume 0, he's been portrayed as a person who grapples with the burden of his loneliness and manifestation of that desire for connection through Rika Orimoto. And despite working through this curse and unraveling it by the end of this prequel story, the cursed aspect of Okkotsu never seemed to go away, and in Jujutsu Kaisen Chapter 261, that part of his character seems to be making a return in a pretty big way. Due to the direness of the situation, a decision had to be made to leave behind his humanity. For the sake of his friends, the world, and Gojo himself, Yuta Okkotsu has become a monster. To understand the importance of Yuta's decision and the burden that he has placed upon himself, it's important that we first explain why the monster is such a prevalent concept in the story and reveal how pervasive this idea truly is in Jujutsu Kaisen. Now, the word monster in this manga holds quite a bit of weight in the story, and upon analysis has a contextual meaning that goes beyond its most basic and generally used definition. Similar to the idea of Sukuna's actions being compared to that of a natural calamity, the word monster is used in very specific contexts, not to denote an immorality, but a change in one's limitations or repudiation of one's humanity. Multiple instances of the word monster being used in the series all lead to this idea, or at least leave the door open for multiple interpretations, such as these. In Chapter 74, for example, when fighting against the newly awakened Gojo, Toji chooses to call him a monster, despite Gojo not doing anything particularly immoral or horrific. All he is doing is fighting and eliminating the person who killed Riko and nearly killed Geto and himself. This alludes to Toji's words having a slightly different meaning than how you or I may instinctively use the word monster. Rather than be an inherent indictment of a person's character, Gege uses this terminology to imply that a person has lost something fundamental to the human experience in order to step beyond it. When someone in Jujutsu Kaisen becomes a monster, they are also no longer human. It's akin to becoming an entirely different species in the way that characters in the story apply this term. In this instance, I think that Toji is just making it clear that Gojo has attached himself from reality and people in a way that simply wasn't the case before, and we know this to be true based on Gojo's own thoughts. Despite caring very much for Riko and likely knowing that his best friend and the closest person to him in the entire world might be dead, in this moment of absolute euphoria, Gojo has no real feelings of vengeance or hatred towards Toji. He's only able to experience the thrill of battle and his own innate powers growing. Without this single-minded desire to live and become strong, Toji's onslaught earlier in this very arc would have certainly killed him, with Gojo dying a human. Because he rejected these restraints on the brink of death, Gojo was able to become something more, something beyond human, and continued down that path till the day that he met an even greater monster and was defeated by it. Conversely, in Chapter 113, when facing Toji in Shibuya, Megumi refers to him as a monster. Now, you can certainly interpret this as him simply marveling at Toji's power and ferocity, but the fact that it's this version of Toji specifically that Megumi is addressing adds another possible interpretation, as in this half-dead state, Toji is moving purely on instinct and a desire to fight the strongest around. There is no reason, no thought, no superfluous emotion present in this character, only the natural inclination to keep destroying and killing until it is him who is destroyed or killed. A true puppet of carnage, much like Ryomen Sukuna. The conditions of Toji's revival led to a vessel being piloted by something that wasn't quite Toji, at least not in the way that we'd ever seen him in the story before. Yet despite the monstrous claims, he doesn't do anything particularly wrong as far as Megumi observes. From his perspective, all Toji has done is defeat a special grade and prepare to fight him as well. What makes him monstrous is his freedom, not from any physical restraint, but mental ones. See, it's an ongoing theme in Jujutsu Kaisen that alongside raw talent and potential, the most important thing for a sorcerer and character's growth is their mindset. The more one is focused on their personal development, the more you'll be able to draw out your latent abilities. Megumi is the most obvious example of this mindset shift, assisting in practical sorcerer abilities, but this is true for every character in the story, and is even acknowledged in the context of humanity in the midst of the Shinjuku Showdown. It's fitting that the idea is a addressed by Arame so explicitly in chapter 245, as they are the character who has likely observed many of Sukuna's battles and seen all kinds of sorcerers from all kinds of eras, being able to draw real comparison points between those from the golden age of Jujutsu and most that call themselves sorcerers in the modern day. The peace brought about by civilization and strong characters like Gojo leads to people becoming more human, and Arame makes it quite clear that they found their connection to humanity to be an obstruction of growth. Discarding that in favor of potentially alienating yourself is how you were able to reach the heights of Satoru Gojo and Ryomen Sukuna. This much is substantiated by both characters who have been considered the strongest at different points in the manga. Both Sukuna and Gojo allude to Megumi's strength only being hindered by a lack of selfish desire, and Sukuna goes on to outright confirm that a curse like Jogo could have become someone on the level of Gojo by burning everything around him to ashes and abandoning his foolish desires to become like humans. Consistently, this relinquishment of a human-like identity is shown to be the method to power, and in fact, as far as we know, it's the only way to achieve this level of strength, which is why Yuta made the decision that he did in this chapter. He ignored what it means to be humane in favor of what will get him results, just like Gojo, just like Kenjaku, and just like Sukuna. For the first time in the entire manga, Yuta is now forced to bear the burden of the strongest like Gojo once did. He has to hold that weight on his shoulders simply because no one else can. Yuta has always been compared to Gojo. He's always been portrayed as his successor, and even his bloodline is connected to Gojo's in some way, albeit distantly. Many people view this plotline as completely unexpected and undeserved in nature, and while I can sympathize with this knee-jerk reaction and certainly agree that Yuta hopping into Gojo's body wasn't on my Jujutsu Kaisen bingo card, the more I think about this chapter and the surrounding context, the more subtle crumbs I see that could have led us to this conclusion. From a foreshadowing perspective, I honestly can't say that this doesn't make sense, because for all of the aforementioned reasons, much of Yuta's characterization and hype has been dependent on being compared to Gojo. In Shibuya, Kenjaku makes it clear that he doesn't think Yuta can become the next Gojo. In the context of that statement, it simply means that he finds Yuta's mindset and skill set unfit for his burden, but his wording becomes painfully ironic with this chapter in a way that makes it hard to deny that on some level, Gege has to have been planning for this. Yuta was able to become Gojo in a literal sense due to his curse technique, but also because he was willing to take on Satoru's mindset as well. Certainly not with the same euphoric vigor as Gojo upon his awakening, but bearing the burden of monsters so that others around you may survive and thrive is something that these two characters have in common. Even Yuta's reintroduction into the story plays on the connection between these two sorcerers in interesting ways. When he shows up, Yuji senses his cursed energy and is immediately reminded of Gojo before amending his thought due to the extra creepy factor of Yuta's aura. Choso calls Yuta a similar type of sorcerer to Gojo, one that you cannot fight straight up without immediately dying. Yuta calls attention to this comparison himself as well, although in typical Yuta fashion, he does so in deference to Gojo, comparing their cursed energy levels and refinement, making clear that while he has more energy, he has considerably less skill in controlling it than his teacher. Even the narrator mentions the two special grades in the same breath, saying that he's second only to Gojo in his unusual abilities. Time after time after time, Yuta is compared to Gojo, but demonstrated to fall short of his sensei in very meaningful and explicit ways. He's not as interesting as Satoru to Sukuna, not as precise with his cursed energy, not as domineering in his personality, and certainly not as skilled with his sorcery. Yuta has always been the closest thing to Gojo, but never close enough. He attempts to take on Gojo's burden alone during Sendai Colony, but once again, both Yuta and the audience are made aware of how painfully second-rate he is when compared to calamitous forces like Sukuna and Gojo, when compared to those that are truly the strongest. The limit Uro spoke of at the tail end of the Sendai Colony wasn't a limit brought on by a lack of potential. It wasn't a limit brought on by a lack of talent. It wasn't a limit brought on by a curse technique deficiency, and it certainly wasn't a limit brought on by Yuta's lack of blessings. The limit she spoke of was simply the edge of humanity. By holding on to it, Yuta could progress no further, grow no stronger, and eliminate the burden of Gojo's strength no more than he already had. And for all of Yuta's posturing, I think that some part of him knew that for a very long time. Maybe he knew it before Uro mentioned it, Or maybe her words are what sparked that realization within him. But as one of the strong, I think some part of Yuta has always known what kind of isolation that strength can bring. He's never been Gojo, and he's never held a burden quite as heavy as his, but Yuta was the closest of Gojo's students to that realm for the longest time. The peak of the mountain that no one else could even dream of, Yuta may have been able to see brief glimpses of, and with every passing glance, it became clearer and clearer what would eventually need to be done. He could no longer delude himself, no longer ignore what it is that he's seen, no longer cling to things that wouldn't help him, which is why in this chapter it seems that the normally meek Yuta Okkotsu exploded with passion and rage about the topic. From his perspective, what Gojo was going through was clear. Yuta had acknowledged this loneliness dozens and dozens of chapters ago. He wanted to be a monster with Gojo so that the person who brought him out of darkness could finally have someone stand beside him again, someone that understands that burden of strength. In an interesting way, it almost reads as if Yuta wanted to take Geto's old role in Gojo's heart and be the strongest together, which becomes increasingly funny and interesting when realizing that Yuta is the one who defeated Geto. Yuta is the one who clashed his own selfish ideals with Geto's and his won out. In framing Yuta's intentions like this, in framing Yuta as someone who wanted to hold that weight with Gojo, I can't help but think of Geto and Gojo's final interaction as allies, as sorcerers who would not have to fight one another on the battlefield. If I could be you, wouldn't my impossible ideal become possible? When Geto asks this question, all he wants is to create a world where his friends can smile happily, a world where no curses are born that take lives too early, a world where he can smile from the depths of his heart. It's unfortunate that in order to achieve that dream, Geto would need to become a monster. How fitting is it that Yuta also has a dream, a simpler dream, a more reasonable dream, but a dream all the same. Yuta wants to be valued, to be cared about, to be loved, and in order to do that, he needs to save his friends. But this time, being strong isn't enough. Being special isn't enough. Being human isn't enough. He needs to become something greater than that. He needs to become a monster. And it's so interesting that in doing so, Geto's question may be answered in the most literal way possible. As he was, Yuta was incapable of answering this. He was too weak for his dream. He was too weak to gather 400 points single-handedly. He was too weak to kill Kenjaku without jeopardizing the health of his friends. He was too weak to finish the fight with Sukuna inside of his own domain. And he was too weak to become the monster his friends needed without one last push from his teacher. A final gift that could only be achieved through death. A gift that may only last Okkotsu 5 minutes. The reception of this gift asks an interesting question we heard oh so long ago. If I could be you, wouldn't my impossible ideal become possible? Now this question no longer remains a hypothetical. It no longer remains something we'll never get the answer to. By copying the technique of the man who stole Geto's body, Yuta has been given an opportunity to seek the solution to Geto's quandary. In the following chapters, we'll see exactly what Jujutsu Kaisen's answer is, what Gege Akutami's answer is. Using the methods of the very antagonists that we all hope are defeated causes many to doubt Yuta's care for Gojo, or any of his students for that matter, but I think that this discourse misses the entire point of this chapter. The morality of this situation is very cut and dry. To use the body of a man after his death, when given permission, is no different than transplanting organs to someone in need after they've opted in. What Yuta is doing morally has no true bearing on this conversation. The problem is that it's Yuta doing it, and it's something he would not do unless his back was against the wall. He's one of the only characters alive on our side that appreciates Gojo to the extent that he deserves as a person. Yet, him even suggesting the idea implies an objectification of that person he cares for so deeply because of his strength. Yuta's not a monster because he made the wrong decision. He's not a monster because he cast aside Gojo's own wishes. He's not a monster because what he's doing is immoral. He's a monster because he's chosen to cast aside his personal limits to win by any means necessary. Just as Gojo reluctantly killed the higher-ups for the sake of his ambitions, contradicting his own statements in the beginning of the story, Yuta now must take on the visage of his teacher in order to clash with Sukuna on even footing. Neither action is inherently immoral, neither action is inherently unjustified, neither action is inherently unreasonable, but they were both personal lines that the two didn't want to cross. Self-imposed boundaries that helped keep them human, but in the face of the threat known as the King of Curses, in the face of a calamity, in the face of a true monster, both Okkotsu and Satoru decided to cast aside those restraints. For Gojo, this wasn't enough, but in the coming chapters, we'll see if it is for Yuta. As of right now, he's crossed into the realm of the strongest, and I don't think there's a way back from that for him. When Sukuna is willing to acknowledge your approach as going further than expected, then you know you've done something very impressive, and potentially something very damning. The monster known as Yuta Okkotsu has awoken, and these next few chapters will allow us to determine if it was all for naught.